Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our free to attend webinar today on how policy works with Simon Newman. My name is Alice McDavid, and I am the head of UK training at DOS Training. So at the moment, we have about 250 people joining, so we'll wait for a few others to join. In typical webinar style, we had some tech issues, but we are hopefully ready and raring to go now. So thanks everybody for joining. Just a few kind of house rules and things about GoToWebinar if people aren't familiar with it. You're all on mute, so this will kind of just be Simon talking through, and then we will leave 15 minutes at the end for any questions that people may have. If you have a question, there is a function to put it in the chat box, and then I will be filtering through them at the end and asking Simon questions. And yeah, hopefully everybody finds this next 45 minutes to an hour very engaging. And yeah, we look forward to maybe developing something more if you find this next hour helpful. So I will now pass over to Simon, and I hope everybody enjoys. And yeah, we'll answer your questions at the end. So thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Alice, if there's any technical problems or issues with my voice or a microphone, camera, etc., then let us know and we'll see what we can do. So obviously still coming on board, which is great. We'll kick off now because quite a lot of cramming to the next 45 minutes to an hour. So thank you for everyone who's joined us today. I'm conscious that I'm competing with Dominic Cummings, so that's good to see more than 300 of you sign up for today. The purpose of today's webinar and session, really, as it says in the title there, is a very sort of quick whistle-stop tour of everything or nearly everything that you need to know about how policy works. And this really is a flavour of what DODS delivers, either on a half day, a full day, or even a week-long course around policy. So throughout the presentation I'll do this morning, just highlight some of the things where we might go into a bit more detail during one of those courses that we offer to government, wider public sector, and of course the private sector as well. And if you have any questions, of course, please use the chat function, as Alice quite rightly said there. She will then collate those and perhaps at the end of the session put some of those towards me, and we can see if we can answer those for you as well. So fingers crossed. Let's start off with our first slide. So very quickly, just summarising what we're going to cover in this morning's session. 7 key topics really, talking you through the process, strategic picture, a bit about what good policy looks like, policy options, which is of course a really important part of policy, implementation, delivery, policy evaluation, and a little bit at the end about why policy goes wrong, and some examples and some case studies that I'll use throughout this morning just to illustrate some of those key points as well. So the first section, very much around getting the policy basics right, and this is something that we really focus on very importantly as part of our day and week-long sessions. So the first thing we generally ask, and what we try and do there, as you'll see in the bottom right hand side, is that we get delegates together and we ask them to come up with what they think the definitions are for those two key terms. So what do we mean by policy, and what do we mean by policy maker? They are two very important terms in terms of the policy life cycle, and there isn't really a standard definition for either. So we try and get them to come up with a single definition together, and we look for certain terms or phrases. And these typically are the types of things that we generally see in terms of how we might define what a policy is. So we talk about being a set of rules and principles, something that perhaps is a strategic direction or intention, it's a framework, a commitment on a particular issue, or maybe even a plan or a course of action. And that's really how we would describe policy in the context of government and the public sector. In terms of a policy maker, again, perhaps 4 things we would highlight here. So someone ultimately who is responsible for policy, which may well be a civil servant, it could arguably be a minister as well. Someone we would describe as an idea generator, comes up with the ideas in terms of government objectives and policies, an instigator for change, and also someone who arguably is a decision maker. Now, normally on the courses we do for those who are new to policy, this is the moment that generally they realise that that's them. This is your role as a civil servant or someone working in another public sector organisation. You are a policymaker in the same way that a minister is as well. So that's the first thing we do, is we set the scene in terms of those definitions and what a policy maker is and what does policy mean as well. We also talk very much around the differences perhaps between policy and strategy and where they fit. I think it's quite interesting. They're often used as interchangeable terms. Does policy sit above strategy? Does strategy sit above policy? And again, we often have a debate and we use some examples to think about how they may fit together. So our next bit of work that we tend to do, and this is a really important part to broaden the understanding of where policies come from, is to try and identify what we consider as those sources. So we ask people to come up with a long list, and on the next slide I've got some of those examples. We get people to think about the box. So what sort of things are out there that help generate governments or generate ideas for governments and the civil service to think about where policies come from? What are the drivers that are out there? And we get to think about, well, do some of those sources actually have a greater influence than others? For example, the role of the media is often cited as being a very, very powerful source on shaping and informing government policy. We also then get people to start thinking about whether they ought to rank them in terms of the order of importance. So is there a hierarchy in terms of those sources? And what we try and put up is a slide like this, and this just illustrates, in my view, some of those really random sources that we might find for people to consider. And so just going very quickly around these, we might see things like pressure groups as a source of policy. Historically, we may look at organisations perhaps like Greenpeace in environmental terms. Black Lives Matter movement, for example, are two good examples of high profile pressure groups that shape and inform government policy. Mention the media as well. Some might argue that newspapers, perhaps like the Daily Mail and the Sun newspaper, are very, very good at influencing government policy on certain issues. Industry as well collectively gets together. Things around carbon targets, for example, very powerful industry bodies there have a direct influence on how government works and shapes its policy. Lobbying in the news perhaps quite recently in terms of the power of lobbyists, probably more mature in other countries like the USA, but again has a really important role in shaping policy within government. Trade bodies, organisations like the Confederation of British Industry and perhaps in the tech industry, Tech UK, for example, are two trade bodies that we may well work with and engage with as a way of understanding what's going on and what are the issues that are pertinent to their members. Events and incidents clearly have a big impact in terms of shaping policy as well, not just in the UK, but of course on a global level as well. Inquiries, public inquiries, another really important source. A lot of work going on at the moment, and the Home Office are involved, of course, in the inquiry into the Manchester arena bombing that took place a few years ago. The Hillsborough inquiry perhaps being another one, the Bishard inquiry, and others. The outcomes of those inquiries with a series of recommendations often dictate and shape government policy for years to come. Party ethos. Traditionally, we may say that perhaps the Conservative Party has a particular view or a philosophy around a particular cause or issue. Labour Party may have an opposing view. Liberal Democrats and other parties perhaps also have a certain view. And these are important in the way of shaping policies going forward. Overseas policies, we are an island, but clearly we are influenced very heavily by what goes on in other countries. It's not just being part, perhaps historically, of the European Union, but from other organisations and other countries' directions as well. Technological change. The growth in technology has been huge over the past 10 to 15 years. It's pretty much inescapable now to move away from any form of technology. Everything we buy up, it seems to be connected to the internet in one way or another. There's really big questions around that. How does that inform policy? And how do we make sure that policy then is fit for purpose and to some degree future-proofed to make sure that we can take account of all those changes that may well be coming in the future as well. Things like the use of AI, for example, rapidly growing in other countries in the UK now, and we're starting to look at how it can be used in different parts of life. Spending reviews seem to be getting shorter now around about every 12 months, have a massive influence on what can be achieved in terms of policy and keep those ambitions tight as well. Demographic changes, if we look over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen perhaps an aging population. That means there's a sudden shift in the way that we have to do our policy. So now the focus very much is around policies that support things like social care, and also health as well becomes really important. So they have a big impact on the way that policy works. Public campaigns. I always think back to the days of Jamie Oliver and his turkey twizzlers as a really good example of where a public campaign led perhaps by a celebrity has changed the way that government has approached its policy in things like school food. Academic research. We have huge numbers of universities here, some extremely talented academics and university students who are able to provide and produce really good evidence-based reports and research that can then inform policy on what we do. Policy reviews as well, something we probably don't do as much as we should do, but we look back on previous policies to see whether they've worked. If they haven't worked, what's gone wrong, and how can we feed that back into the process going forward so that we can make sure future policies don't make the same mistakes as the ones that have preceded them. Sometimes letters to MPs also has an impact on developing policy. Members of the public writing to their local MP on a particular issue may well end up in the House of Commons being discussed and adopted by government as a particular policy route. Trends as well. I mean, we talked about demographic changes, but other trends as well in terms of buying power, the way that people commute into work, etc., and their preferences, all has an impact on shaping government policy. Judicial reviews, the impact, the recommendations that come out of that can have a big impact. Some of you may well have been involved in judicial reviews in part of your careers in the public sector, but very, very impactful and clearly has a big impact on government. Published reports as well, not just from the private sector. Private sector produces lots of studies and reports which are really helpful in getting a detailed understanding of particular challenges, but also in terms of departments as well will often produce their own reports on their areas of work. And these again are really useful sources of information that help us develop and inform that policy. Court cases, much in the same way as judicial reviews. Select committees, clearly there's a very important one going on today which is being publicised widely. They're also a very good way of ministers and others being able to hold people to account for certain things, and frequently now, as we're seeing on a more often basis, that people from industry and leaders from outside government are being brought in and challenged and questioned by select committee members on particular policy areas. International treaties, historically again we talk about the European Union, perhaps even things like NATO and G7 also are really important sources of policy. Manifestos, when parties are standing for election, they will have a clear set of policy priorities that are articulated in the hope that the public want to vote for those particular policy areas, and of course then build those if they are successfully elected into government. Think tanks as well, lots and lots of different think tanks, some very specific, some more general, producing reports and ideas and generating these things that are then fed back into government and developing policy. And perhaps the last one we've got here is around ministerial legacy. This is where a minister in their short time in office wants to leave a legacy behind, something that they feel that they want to see as something that they can champion and possibly even put their name on it. So what we try and do in this exercise, and we generally take about 20 minutes, is get people to list as many of those sources as policies that they can think of. And there straight away we've got 20 examples, and there are many, many more than that. But the idea, of course, as a policymaker and as a civil servant and someone involved in the public sector, is to try and get as much of a grasp as possible on all of those sources of policies, so that you know your area as detailed as you can. Now, clearly you can't read everything that's out there, but it's important that you spread your research as widely as you can and get to understand some of the issues and the causes that underline the policies you're working on. So we start off with our first principle, and as I mentioned, this is based around 10 key principles. So the first principle, and this is a really important one, is about recognising the difference between policy-based evidence and evidence-based policy. Through DODS, we run a really good short course that's about policy-based evidence and evidence-based policy, and it talks you through some of the challenges and the problems. And I really just wanted to highlight here at a very, very high level some interesting issues that we face in terms of what those two terms mean and how they operate. And the other thing, of course, to be a really important factor is being really careful with the evidence that you actually use and how you can actually present that. And there's a case study that I use, albeit not in a government perspective, but I think it's a great example of how evidence is used in certain ways. So what do we mean by evidence-based policy? Well, evidence-based policy is basically it's a policy that's informed by evidence. So what I've used here is an example, perhaps more related to the Home Office. If we look at things that probably keep us up and awake at night, and perhaps those Home Office civil servants are concerned about, 8 key areas of crime, which clearly are significant and also have a huge impact on victims and an economic impact on the country as well. I mean, taking fraud and cyber as an example, that's roughly 45% of all crime that's out there at the moment. We see in the news pretty much every night incidents around knife crime. Lots of focus, rightly so, at the moment around violence and domestic violence. Terrorism, clearly something that always causes a concern. So we know there's lots and lots of evidence that's out there supports that these 8 things are arguably the 8 biggest priorities that we should be focused on as a government around our policy in terms of keeping people safe. However, if we go and ask the public what they think is most important, we generally get these 2 things. bad parking and dogs fouling the pavement. And you can argue they're not even policing or government issues to resolve. And this is what policy-based evidence is about. It's basically about a minister, possibly, or the public identifying a policy that they want implemented without really there being the evidence base to back it up. And so arguing in this situation is what civil servants often find themselves, is that rather than providing the evidence and finding the evidence to then support options, to then set a direction in terms of a policy to choose, we find the other way around here is that someone's already decided what the policy is, and your job is to go and find the evidence to back up the discussion. And there are risks in both of those approaches. In today's session, we won't go into too much detail around that, but it's just important to know the difference between those two areas. Just interesting on bad parking, I live in a reasonably modern estate here in Cambridgeshire. The police have been driving around in the last 3 days, visiting every road and putting tickets on people who've been bad parking, which has been quite interesting, and the Facebook community page has been rather busy. Now, I talked about using evidence wisely, and this is a really good case study from the US, which I love using, from the Ford Motor Company. And this is about cost-benefit analysis. So this often features as a really important part of your evidence base when you're proposing options for ministers to consider around policy. Now, this goes back to the 1970s and a car that the Ford Motor Company introduced called the Pinto. Now, put this into context, back in the 1970s, the US was facing a couple of big challenges in its motor industry. The first was the threat from Japan. Japan was producing small, very economic and efficient vehicles at great speed and at low cost. And this presented a huge challenge to the US in terms of their traditional model that they were developing. Also, we had at that time the oil crisis as well. So the appetite for big gas guzzling Cadillacs and Chevrolets was becoming less popular by the public, and they wanted things that were more efficient and smaller and more manageable to use. So Ford decided to bring out a small family car called the Pinto. Now, because of the rush that they needed to do this to address the challenge from the Japanese, it didn't go through the safety checks that a normal car necessarily would. And it had one significant design flaw. And the significant design flaw in this case was the fact that it actually had a fuel tank which was located directly behind the rear bumper. So in low impact crashes of 20 or 30 miles an hour, it had a tendency to explode and cause serious harm or death to the occupants inside. So Ford were faced with a bit of a dilemma here. They were seeing the number of casualties involved in these incidents rising quite significantly and had a difficult decision to make. This slide here is an actual excerpt from the memo that was sent by the analysts within the Ford Motor Company to their senior managers and directors to decide upon. And so effectively what they looked at was from a purely financial perspective. And the two things here is to make a decision for their directors. So you have a choice. On the one hand, we allow people to carry on and be injured and sadly die in these car accidents. And if that was to happen, we estimate that we'd probably lose about 180 people, maybe 180 other would have serious burn injuries, and we'd lose about 2,000 vehicles. And these are the costs that we estimate would be involved in those incidents, just under $50 million. However, if we were to go and recall all those vehicles, we've got 11 million cars and 1.5 million light trucks. Even though it would only cost $11 to make those vehicles safe, it would actually cost us $137.5 million to make. So naturally, Ford directors were presented with this information and made the decision purely on financial basis, and as a consequence chose option A, effectively to let people continue to be injured and die as a result of those design flaws. Now, the reality was it didn't quite work out as successfully as Ford may have thought it did. The first case, I think, that came to court, they ended up paying out several £1 million in compensation. And of course, the reputational harm to Ford was huge as well. So because the analysts that were doing their work there were purely looking at on the evidence in terms of the financial basis, they didn't take into consideration the other factors as well. And it almost put Ford into bankruptcy. Now, there's an example used from the private sector, but it's a really good example that shows why the importance of using evidence in the right way to support decisions and your policy options going forward. So session 2, we talk about the strategic picture. What's policy, evidence and delivery and how they all fit together. And the one thing I would say that I'm really keen for you to take away from today's session is what we call the policy Venn diagram. And this shows the relationships between politics, evidence and delivery. So politics, it's given it controlled or responsibility of ministers. The evidence generally sits with civil servants and those working in the public sector. And delivery is those responsible for the delivery, perhaps internal within the civil service, or possibly with private sector partners as well. And the three of them are really important to fit together, and clearly there's an overlap. So the question we ask around politics: who supports the policy and why? What's the rationale behind it? Who is against it? And what are their reasons for that as well? In the evidence, what is it that we already know about the particular problem or policy area that we've been asked to look at? What do we need to find out? What are the gaps? Are there any gaps that you can't fill? COVID's a really good example of that. In the pandemic, we had a lot of information that we just simply didn't know at the time last year. So it was very, very hard to formulate policy with significant amounts of evidence. There were lots and lots of gaps. And on the delivery side, very important to think about what delivery issues we might face in our policy making role. What do we already know about delivery in this policy area? Have we got examples from history that have shown us what's worked and what's necessarily not worked? And have you thought about unintended outcomes? And I'll focus a little on that last bullet point a little bit later on, which is one of probably my favorite areas around policy. So really important things and some questions that we ask. And again, in the sessions that we run with DODS, we spend a lot of time on this because it's really important to understand the relationships and the overlaps as well between those three circles. So the next question we ask around the policy Venn diagram, of course, is what happens if one of these circles is then removed? And that's really quite critical. So if we remove the politics circle, what happens? Well, the policy lacks a strategic direction and ownership from ministers. If we move the evidence circle, and the basis for the policy is flawed because we haven't got the evidence to back up the arguments or the options that we're proposing. And of course, if we take away the delivery element, then the chances of us achieving successful outcomes or the benefits that we've identified initially are really low. And that's really critical. So the relationship between those three circles is absolutely critical and essential to the policy development lifecycle. So our second principle, make sure you are absolutely clear what the government wants to achieve. And the person there holding the banner, absolutely right. What does success look like? Really important to get a clear understanding around what success looks like. And I thought I'd just put this here as a way of just underlining some of the challenges that we face in developing policy in the current climate. So at the moment, we have a 5-year policy or 5-year election cycle. And I know I've just sort of put arbitrary years and it will fluctuate depending on the policy you're working for. But the point of this diagram is to show how challenging it is to create policy in a very, very limited window. Now, I spent 4 years working in the Middle East, where in effect you have a crown prince and a ruling family. And of course, they don't really have elections. So they can stipulate policy life cycles for 20, 30, 40 years without fear of those things changing directions. But of course, in democracies, we have to work to much shorter timescales. So what happens, of course, is a party becomes elected based on its manifesto. The public have agreed that they want or given the mandate for them, the government, to go and deliver those policy commitments. So in year one, the focus of government and working together with the civil service is to try and define those manifesto commitments in a bit more detail. Perhaps in year two, we might go out and consult with stakeholders. We fine-tune those proposals. We get them more informed using that evidence. Year three, perhaps we then go ahead and we want to seek approval from Parliament if we decide to go and legislate for our policy options that we presented to ministers. Maybe into year four, we then go into our implementation phase. That's where we're embedding it into practice. And of course, in year five, what we really need to do is show the benefits of those policy in practice, because those benefits effectively will then be used as the government goes back at the end of that year five period to say, in year one, you asked us to do this. This is what we've done. And these are the benefits that we've realized as a result of that work. And that has two impacts. The first, it means that a lot of policy making tends to be very short-term focused, or we look for quick wins. We look for things that are really quick and can be the low-hanging fruit in terms of those policy objectives. The second part of it, which I think is equally important, is that the actual time you've got to develop the policy base or the evidence base is very, very short indeed. Now, clearly, some policies will go on for much longer and more larger, and infrastructure programs, HS2, for example, are over 10, 15 years, and benefits may not be realised for many, many years and even decades in advance. But that's just a very, very quick and dirty way of saying that the pressures on policymakers to get the policy right and to get that evidence and present it in a way that can be decided by ministers is a real challenge, which is why the skills of the policy people are really, really quite critical. So moving again onto our process, and perhaps I wanted to introduce the one that we use and perhaps most commonly used across the UK government at the moment. So this is what we call the ROMEF cycle. In the full day course, the little box says there, what we try and do is we introduce it, we talk about each of those stages in some detail, and then we ask the delegates who are attending to see if they can work out where their policy is in that cycle. It may not always be obvious, but it's always a good way of checking to see where you are. So in effect, what the boxes there, the six boxes we've got around that cycle mean. The first of all is the rationale. The rationale is why we're doing this particular policy. So that goes about what is government's role and are we really clear exactly what the government wants to achieve. Second box around objectives. Again, what are we trying to achieve? What does success look like? And can we articulate in a way that has some clear deliverables? Appraisal really is where we start developing and considering options. So how are we going to solve the problems that we've identified? Monitoring really is around implementation. How are we going to implement the policy, embed it into practice, and what controls are we going to put in place to make sure that it's on its right path? Then we've got an evaluation. How successful has the policy been? Has it achieved its initial targets, initial aims? And then feedback is once that policy is embedded in practice, it becomes business as usual. And how do we capture? What mechanisms do we use to capture a continual review so that we can inform the development of that policy in the future? That may be refining it in a few years' time, it may be replacing it, updating it, and so on. And you can find a lot of information about this on the bottom left-hand side of that screen, which is called the Green Book. And it's a really important book that policymakers should always have at hand. You can download it for free on the government website, and it's called the Green Book. And it's a really good read around the Theroma Cycle and a lot of other areas around doing cost-benefit analysis as well. Now, within the Green Book, there's something called the 5-case model. And again, I'm not going to go through into any great detail on this today, but just worth highlighting that those 5-case models is really around the strategic case. So this is around the business case in terms of the rationale and the reason for doing the policy. We talk about the economic case, cost-benefit analysis, and the impact on society. So this is about the impact longer term, not just in the short term. There's the commercial case. Are there particular procurement angles that you consider? Do you need to involve a third party, perhaps from the private sector, to get involved to deliver some of those elements of the policy? The financial case is, of course, what's it going to cost? And that's not just in terms of development costs, but it's also in terms of the longer term impacts on society as well. So is there going to need to monitor it? Is there going to be a need to review, and so on and so on? That's important to think about full life cycle costs. And of course, the final part is the management case. And the management case really is what I describe as a project plan. This is your delivery plan of how you're going to actually make the policy come to life and embed it into practice. So very, very briefly, that's the Theroma Cycle. It's the one that's generally used by most government departments. It's used internationally. I've seen it in other places around the world, but really important to get to know it and understand how it fits within your own policy areas. And as suggested, the Green Book is one of those essential on your reading list. I've just put this slide up very briefly. Again, I don't want to go into any great detail on this, but this was to show really how policy making in the Theroma Cycle fits into some other activities around government. And you'll notice I've made, as well as mentioned to the Green Book there, you'll see something called the Aqua Book and the Magenta Book. I'll be touching on the Magenta Book a little bit later on, where we talk about policy evaluation. The Aqua Book is all about developing options and how you appraise options and the methodologies behind it. But what you can see in this particular diagram is that there are a number of stages and steps and processes that you need to go through. And what we do on the day-long course or the week-long course is go into that into some depth, because you can see exactly what stage is your policy at and what needs to be done at which particular stage as well. So what does good policy look like, and sort of introducing those 10 key principles. So we start off again moving into principle 3, and I think this is one of my favorite principles, which is about avoid solutioneering. So what do we mean by solutioneering? Okay, so have to excuse my clumsy diagram. No expense spared on this presentation. That is a tree, it's not a piece of broccoli. But I wanted to show you the difference about what solutioneering means, and again, using perhaps a law enforcement example to illustrate this quite well. So let's take something like burglary. So burglary is something that happens across the country, certainly in the past few weeks as the COVID restrictions have started to be relaxed, and I work in policing most of the time, we've seen an increase in burglary around the country. So a symptom of that is, and we may have a minister or another public official say something along these lines. So burglary has risen by 35% over the past 5 years. We must do something about it. So this is a knee-jerk reaction to a problem or a set of statistics that we see. So straight away, policy people have a tendency to start thinking about solutions. So jumping straight into a solution. And we come up with things like this. So people might propose, for example, tougher sentences. If we have more people locked up, they're locked away for longer, then they're less likely perhaps to commit burglary. Or we might want to see more police patrols. But the problem with that is that we don't know necessarily whether that's going to work or address the problem. What we really want to understand is the underlying problem or the root cause, and those are meant to be roots. And actually, the question we really should be asking as policy people is, why do people commit burglary in the first place? 2 examples there, not exclusive, but maybe it's to fund drug use. It could be potentially as a way of surviving, maybe linked to poverty. So actually, if we really want to reduce burglary, we should be targeting the root cause of the problem and not what we class as the symptom. And that's a really important point about avoid solutioneering. So don't just jump straight to a solution. Spend a lot of time as a policy in your policy role actually understanding what are the problems, what are the reasons that this problem is presenting itself, and try and dig below those headline figures and look at the things underneath. And the more time we spend at the beginning part of the process, the better the quality of our policy will be, and the more likely it is to be successful in addressing that problem. If we focus just on solutions, chances are we miss the problem in the first place. So avoiding solutioneering for me is a really, really important principle to remember as part of our policy process. So what does good policy look like? Well, there's loads of work that's out there, some really good stuff from the Institute for Government. I've just taken this from the Department for Education, which is something developed a few years ago. And these are what they call the 5 world-class policy tests. And I think these are good reminders as a way of describing what we think good policy looks like. So the first one is about having a clear purpose. What's the point? Are you absolutely clear what government wants to achieve? And again, use these tests as a way of looking at your own policy areas as well if you're involved in that work at the moment. Secondly, its role. What's it got to do with us? Are you absolutely clear what the role of government is? Should government be involved? Not everything's for government to be involved. Sometimes we like the private sector, and rightly so, to take the lead on certain issues. The third one there is around the evidence base. Who made you the expert? Are you confident that you're providing world-leading policy advice based on latest thinking? When I've been working with the ministers, one of the questions I was always asked is, what happens elsewhere? What does countries like Sweden do? How do they deal with this particular problem? What about France? What about Germany? What about the US? So having that broad understanding of what goes on outside the UK is really, really important. Predictability, creativity. Is your advice predictable? Are you confident that you've explored the most radical and creative ideas, and also including doing nothing? Now, it's not to say necessarily that we can always get the most ambitious idea through ministers, and there are challenges with that. But what the ministers generally want to see is that we've thought creatively about options when we're presenting them. So it isn't just about a question of do something, do the Rolls-Royce model, and maybe do the basic and do nothing. It's actually looking at a problem and coming up with some really, really innovative solutions to addressing it. And the final test there is around delivery. And of course, the really important question to ask, will it actually work? Are you confident that it can be delivered in the timescales provided? And that's really important, because the last thing a minister wants to do is to stand up in Parliament and explain why their policy hasn't been delivered on time or on budget. So those are really good tests that we use, and I think really important to consider when you're working on your own policy areas. So developing policy options, section 5, about innovation creativity. What I'm just going to show you on this slide here is, first of all, is moving to our 4th principle, which is about being innovative, creative and realistic and avoiding that predictability. This table that you'll see here is taken from a Houses of Parliament report, which I think is a really good way. And what we tend to do on our full day and our week-long courses is we run a theme through the week. And we tend to pick a policy area. Now, that may well be related to a particular government department if we're doing it just for one department, or if we've got guests from many different departments, we perhaps pick something that's perhaps in the news at the moment, or maybe even a future policy area that those people might be working on in some capacity. And we run it as a theme. And we get people to do some work around crunching the problem, as we've seen so far, and then we get to the point where we discuss around options. And this is a really great exercise to run, where we start saying, okay, let's think creatively. Use this as a guide to help you think of some options, no matter how way out that you might think they are. And this is what we class as sort of a carrot and a stick approach. So the role of government, if you look on the left-hand side of that chart or the scale, is very much around the stick. This is where government has a really, really big role. So we'd expect you to think about options that cover the whole spectrum here. So if you look on the left-hand side, government regulates the individual, really important and strict measures that government may introduce, restricting choice or eliminating choice, prohibiting certain goods or banning certain things. So drugs are prohibited in some, or certain drugs are prohibited, or we might restricting options. The example used there is around restricting options of people wanting to smoke. If we go to the other end of the scale, this is where government's role takes a step backwards, and we actually rely on the individual. So use of social norms and salience. We provide information. So the role of government is purely to inform, but we expect people to change their behaviour towards the way they approach stuff. Now, this is arguably easier to implement or easier to get through, and generally doesn't require legislation, but the chance of success for that may well be less so. And so we use this scale to generate discussion, and working in their groups, delegates generally come up with about 20, 30, sometimes even 40 different policy options that we can then start crunching through in order to shortlist those as we get to perhaps 3 or 4 that we may want to consider presenting to minister. So thinking broadly, thinking outside the box, really important, and working in that environment where you have no barriers. And often some of the best ideas come from using this as a way of generating some thinking on what might work and what might not work. So I talked about unintended consequences or unintended outcomes earlier, and this is an area that I really wanted to focus on because it's a really, really important part of policy making that quite often gets overlooked. So we go back to our magenta book, there is in the top right hand side of the page. So an unintended consequence, it can occur when a policymaker doesn't fully understand what impact their policy intervention may have, and it can have a significant effect on the realization, achievability of its benefits. And the magenta book talks about 4 particular unintended consequences. So it talks about displacement, first of all, positive outcomes promoted by government, offset by a negative outcome of the same policy. Great example, if we look at town centres, we might have a problem with antisocial behaviour. So what happens is that we flood the area perhaps with uniformed police officers. All that does is it doesn't address the problem or the underlying problem, it simply shifts it to another part of town or to another town centre. So that's the unintended consequence in that respect. Substitution, the effect of an intervention on a part, individual, group or area that only realise at the expense of others. So for example, employee schemes as the example is given there from a government scheme rather than a standard applicant. So again, substitution is a really important part of an unintended consequence. Leakage, so benefits actually realised outside the area you're targeting. Jobs generated in a target area taken by those who live outside it. And then the final one here is around dead weight. So we make all of this effort, we put a huge amount of investment of time and money into these policy areas, and actually these things would have happened even if we hadn't got involved. So those are the 4 that the magenta book talks about. And the real important role here for policymakers is to try and think about what unintended consequences. So how do people behave when you're faced with a policy situation? And the example I like to use is this one around Mexico. Now, this is a great example. It's been used in a number of different countries. So going back to the 1980s, Mexico, and the picture on there, as I think you can see, and anyone been to Mexico probably will have an understanding of this, has a real issue with pollution. And what the government was starting to see was some significant issues in terms of the health of the nation. So they were seeing an increased number of children being born with birth defects. They were seeing issues with productivity of the workforce. They were seeing other ill health. And of course, this was causing them huge issues with productivity and arguably the impact on their GDP as well. So they came up with an idea, and this is a classic example of solutionism. So what's solutioneering? So what we'll do is we'll limit the number of people who are allowed to drive into Mexico City on a given day. The idea, of course, is that what we'll try and do is get people to use public transport, or we'll get them to car share. And if we can do that, we may be able to reduce pollution by up to 20%. Now, reducing pollution by 20% will have a significant number of benefits, health benefits, productivity benefits, and so on and so on. And so they got very excited about this. So what they tried to do was come up with this scheme. And if you look on the bottom left-hand side here, this is exactly what they decided. So in effect, you look there on Monday, if your car number plate ended with a number 5 or a number 6, you weren't allowed to drive into the city. If you did, you would be fined. On a Tuesday, the number 7 or 8, and so on and so on. And they thought this was the mechanism as a way of trying to drive that change. Now, clearly, what they hadn't done was consulted effective enough for the public, because faced with this, what they didn't realise is that the Mexican population weren't actually keen on using public transport. It either wasn't reliable, it wasn't safe, it wasn't convenient, and they certainly weren't keen with jumping in a car with their neighbour. So in the end, what happened? Well, the Mexican public simply went out and bought a second-hand car, but they only bought a second-hand car that they needed to use for 1 day a week. So inevitably, they spent as little money as possible on that, and generally bought something which was very old, which meant arguably it was also very polluting. So the net result of that is, instead of reducing pollution by 20%, pollution actually rose by 17%. So they hadn't taken enough time to get to understand what the causes behind that problem, and equally how would the population respond to the policy intervention that the government came up with. So many countries around the world have tried this and have learned some of those lessons. So very briefly on consultation and engagement, again, another really important area for us in terms of how policy works. Consultation absolutely is a really great way to test the thinking with your stakeholder community, exactly as we just described there with the Mexico example. But getting the balance right in terms of when, who and how to consult, of course, is key. And there's some really good work that's in the government guidance, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Some of you may have come across this already, called the Mendeley Matrix. This is an exercise we love running as part of our policy courses. And again, it's a really good way of just testing where you think your stakeholders fit. So the first exercise really is we get people to work with a set of post-it notes and simply to put up on a chart all of the stakeholders that they work with. That includes in government, across government, interest groups, members of the public, depending on your policy area. And we get them to list potentially up to 100 stakeholders that they see. What we then get them to do is to work in groups and to say, well, okay, where do they fit on that matrix? So can you identify where they are in terms of their level of interest and their level of influence? So once they put those post-it notes, that gives us a really good indication of where those people currently sit. And of course, we then have a discussion about, well, how do you move those people perhaps who've got a low level of interest, but we want them to have a high level of interest? And we start debating about the exercises that we can do to get them to move up to a higher level. Equally, there are some that perhaps might be of a high level interest, and we don't want them to be quite so actively involved or have so much of an interaction with us at that level. And so the Mendeley matrix then talks about how you respond to that. And it's a really good piece of work, again, which just gets people thinking about the broader stakeholder community. Really, really important that we engage with those stakeholders and we use them as much as we can to help inform our policies to ensure that they're fit for purpose. And then finally, just around consultation and engagement with stakeholders, you can see the government runs a huge number of consultations with the public and others on a very regular basis. And these are some principles that we sort of cover here, really. So the first thing for us is understanding the difference between consultation and engagement. So consultation really is about a formal process. It's about going out and consulting on a particular policy area or a particular aspect of a policy area. Engagement is something that we do on a routinely basis as a policy person. It's absolutely critical. One of the things I'm always very passionate about when I worked in the civil service is getting to know your target audience. So that means getting out of London if you're based in London and going to speak to the communities who are going to be impacted in your policy in some way. Really, really critical. Second part, of course, is understanding why do we consult and being clear on what it exactly is that we're going to be consulting on. We don't just want to throw open the barriers and say, here's a policy, we want your feedback. We actually want to try and direct people to focus on particular issues or areas that either we want some more information on or that we've got a particular challenge in understanding. And the third part is how do we consult? Of course, increasingly, we rely very much now on technology. So we're gifted in the sense that we can reach probably a far higher number of individuals than we may have done in a few years ago by the use of email and surveys that we can do online. But we need to think about accessibility as well. The language we use, the formats that we use, and of course there are communities that are particularly hard to reach, and we may need to think about perhaps using intermediaries to make sure that we get their feedback and involvement as well. And of course the other thing is around timing. When do we need to consult? Obviously avoiding certain times of the year. Summer holidays generally aren't great. Christmas holidays is another area we try and avoid, and also around election periods, which is another no-no. So we need to think very carefully about the right time. And of course we're competing with other parts of government who will want to consult often the same groups on the same issues. Again, just putting that list up there, there's a link at the bottom, which is a really good source of information. There are some principles that were developed by the Cabinet Office, and I think these are really good ways of framing any consultation exercising that you're doing in relation to policy. And I'll put that at the bottom around consultation fatigue. Clearly, we'd love to go out as often as possible to consult, but there's only a certain appetite that people have got. So we need to make sure that we judge that very carefully and make sure we prioritise what we're going to consult, who we're going to consult, and how. So move on to section 7. I said this is a real whistle-stop tour. Implementation delivery, and two really important parts of the process. Implementation for me is very much around the process of embedding policy into practice, and delivery effectively is the business as usual. Really important, and often one area that can quite often be overlooked, as key principle 7 there says. And it's an important point to remember, the policy cycle doesn't end when it's been approved or legislated. It's an important part of the process, easily overlooked. What I mean by that is that it's really exciting developing a policy, getting it through the parliamentary process and getting it legislated. But your responsibility and role doesn't end then. Think about policy in that full life cycle. Your responsibility continues until those benefits have been realised. That's a really important consideration to take. So why is it important? Well, there's 6 things here we say about why implementation is so important as part of the process. So those that are implementing clearly have a higher chance of achieving those desired benefits. Helps us manage change in a coordinated way, reduces the impact on our organisation, of course, and those that we're implementing the policy on as well. Helps us be more efficient in the way that we use our resources. Also, it helps us understand the impact that our policies have on stakeholders. Quite often you'll see in a lot of implementation of policy, it's done in a phased approach. Phasing helps us test things out first of all. We learn the lessons from doing it in practice. What can we improve? How can we make those changes so that in the second phase we can learn and we can develop more efficiently? If we don't, of course, implement our policy, then compliance generally could be quite low. And that creates a problem. It has an impact in terms of the benefits and also means that we don't achieve what we set out to achieve as well. And of course, again, this is back to the phased approach here, is that we can manage out potential problems with a policy before it goes live. So implementation is really, really important part of that process. We also talk about delivery, and a checklist that's often quite well used as a way of setting out whether we've done everything is what we call a delivery plan. And I quite like this as a template, as a way of just making sure that we've done everything we needed to do before we go live. So ask yourself those questions on the policies that you're doing. Are we clear that we know what the aims and outcomes from the policy is? Are we clear what the rationale is? What's the driver of undertaking policy in the first place? Do we know what the risks are? How are we going to mitigate those risks? Can we transfer some of those risks? Have we identified the interdependencies? That's really important as well, both across government, with other initiatives, other policy areas, and outside government as well. Commercial aspects. Have we thought about procurement issues? Procurement's incredibly complicated. Bringing on people who understand procurement and procurement legislation is a really important part of that process as well. Financial aspects. Where's the money coming from? Who's going to pay for the policy? And have you thought about contingencies? Government policy is complicated, absolutely. And we often need to think about the fact that they do go over budget from time to time. So if we need extra money, where are we going to get it from? Who's going to pay for it? What are the key milestones? This is something that ministers very much are interested in. What can we describe? What are those quick wins that we can be able to articulate back to a minister? Communications to stakeholders. How are we going to communicate it to stakeholders? When? What frequency? And mechanisms that we might use. And what about governance? Have we appointed someone who's going to manage this? Effectively, when we go into delivery, we think about it as a project. So very important to think about who's going to lead it on that basis. And then evaluation, and I'll come on to evaluation in a moment, but important that we evaluate the policy as well. So that's just a little checklist that we quite often use as a way of setting a delivery plan. And again, in the week-long course that we do, once they've come up with their options, we will then get the delegates to write a delivery plan for their policy. And that's quite useful because it often throws up some additional questions and challenges perhaps they hadn't thought of before. So evaluation. Now, great principle to start with is about always develop policy with evaluation in mind. So right at the very beginning of that process, when we're thinking about the policy and the problem that we're trying to analyze, think about how are we going to evaluate this? How are we going to measure success? How will we know when we've achieved what we set out to achieve? So evaluation, whilst it does happen in the end, it's also important to think about it right at the beginning part of the process as well. So we go back to our magenta book there it is. An evaluation is covered in the magenta book. It's a really good and an easy read. And it talks about what evaluation is, examining the actual implementation and impacts of a policy to assess whether the anticipated effects, costs and benefits were in fact realised. And it talks about three types of evaluation: process, impact and economic. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this one here, but these are some hints and tips that the book has around why we evaluate policy and some of those benefits, and also what happens should we decide not to evaluate it. And I think these are really quite important in terms of some of the learning. And I've got a good example here. So if anyone's working in the Home Office, I use this as a really good example of where I think the Home Office did a really cracking job in terms of evaluation, both in their approach and how they presented this. So some of you may remember this. Every now and again, these appear in the media and on the news as an example of a policy around dealing with an alleged immigration issue. So we go back to 2013. This was something which was called Operation Vacum, and it was a Home Office policy that sought to tackle illegal immigration. So we go back to thinking about sources of policy, and on the bottom right-hand side, you know, the media, Daily Mail and the Sun, perhaps were stoking up quite a lot of interest around illegal immigration. And of course, the public were then generating questions, writing to their members of Parliament. And so the government, as a knee-jerk reaction, said, right, we've got to do something about this. We need to do something very visible, and we need to do something very quick. So the Home Office said, okay, well, let's think about this. So the idea came out, and I think this was originally from Australia, was to run a trial in London across 6 London boroughs. And this was the idea of these go home vans and a Twitter campaign as well. And the idea, of course, is that an illegal immigrant may well see these vans and either be encouraged to go and phone the number and arrange their self-deportation to their own country rather than risk arrest. And it used a various number of advertising slogans, 106 arrests last week in your area, as a way of promoting how successful it was as well. And these vans drove around London. Now, the Home Office had some reservations of whether this was going to be the right approach to take in tackling the problem. And so they set out an evaluation criteria. So we said, okay, we need to measure this. We need to understand, and this is how we'll tell whether this has been successful. Bearing in mind it was a pilot. So if you want to roll it out on a national level, let's assess a pilot first of all. And on the right-hand side, there's a really good report, which you can still download, and it's a really good read. And I think a great document written by the Home Office on how to do an evaluation. And so this is effectively the results that they first started seeing when they ran that short trial. So 1,500 texts from the public, 60 illegal immigrants were initially left to leave the UK voluntarily, and it was a very, very low cost. So a very, very small investment compared to forcibly removing someone from the country. So on the basis of those statistics, you say, yeah, looks like a success, and arguably could be something that could be rolled out on a national basis. However, what the Home Office did is then crunch through some of that data in a lot more detail. And what they found was something very different. And only 2% of the messages that they actually got were related to a genuine illegal immigrant. And a large percentage, the majority of those text messages, actually proved to be hoax. So it wasn't particularly successful. But there were also some other problems. So the adverts were banned by the Advertising Standards Authority. Liberty, and you can see on the bottom right-hand side there as well, put their own version of the van up, which followed these vans around, saying that the Home Office think again. And of course, the Twitter campaign, interestingly, had a different effect. Many people expressing sympathy for some of the images that were being shown of people being deported. And we only have to look at the scenes in Glasgow, perhaps last week or the week before, when the Home Office vans were there to deport 2 individuals from a house. And actually, when the Home Office looked at it, it was believed that, in fact, the impact of that was that 0 individuals actually left behind. So as a result of that, the policy was dropped and it wasn't rolled out nationally. So a really good example of where evaluation can work very effectively in setting the scene. So as we draw to a close, I just wanted to give you some examples of when policy goes wrong, and of course some examples of when it goes well. So principle 9, of course, is making sure that your policy works. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the importance of making sure that your options are realistic and achievable, and this is really important. So why does policy fail? Well, there's a really great book, if you haven't read it already, on the right-hand side there, The Blunders of Government, which is by Anthony King and Ivor Crew. It's a must read, a really, really good and a great easy read. It's non-political. It talks about policy failures from government from around about 1945 or post-war all the way up to, I think, about 2010. And it interviews civil servants, ministers, and those affected by the policy. And it really gives a great appraisal on what works and what doesn't work. And they describe 2 things, or 2 factors: human factors and system failures. And these human factors, I think, are really important. And there's 3 here I would particularly pull out. So number 1, I think, is really important. Policymakers unaware of the circumstances, attitudes, and experience of those whom the policy is directed. This is about understanding who you're implementing the policy to and getting to know your target audiences. Operational disconnect, which is number 4 on the human factors. So a divorce between those who make the policies and those who have responsibility for implementing it. This is about working together, policy teams working not just in a policy bubble, but working with people involved in the delivery and the implementation of the policy as well, working together and understanding it. And of course, number 5, panic, symbol and spin. The knee-jerk policy reaction to an issue shows the government doing something, but not necessarily the right thing to solve the problem. And of course, system failures, there's generally 3 things there. The centre cannot hold, absolutely. Well, the complexity of government is clear. Limited in terms of perhaps accountability, but very complex. And understanding how it works makes it quite often develop policy in that environment. And number 3 goes back to this point about solutioneering, the deficit of deliberation. Too little time spent on thinking the problem through properly or speaking to the right people about it, which means that our policies end up being not as good as they could be. So a couple of examples of things that work, or one example that works well. So you'll be familiar with the national minimum wage. And again, I won't go through this in great detail because we're running out of time, but just gives a really good example of why it works. And the reasons on the right-hand side are articulated there. Number 6, I think, is quite important. So one of the things the policymakers did in that role is that they looked at what had gone in the past. So they read and realised that under the Labour Party, when Kinnock was leading, he'd also proposed something very similar. So they looked at some of the proposals around that and looked at the evidence behind it as well. And they obviously had a very clear strategy on making it work. Now, at the time, there was a lot of opposition to it, certainly from the Conservative Party. But if you notice on that 4th bullet point there, they dropped their opposition to it in 2010 and, of course, now replaced it with the national living wage. So national minimum wage, or living wage, is considered as a huge, huge policy success and continues to be successful to this day. One that was perhaps less successful, the abolition of the Audit Commission. And again, on the right-hand side, perhaps if I draw your attention to that, some really important factors. So this was a decision that was driven arguably by an individual as opposed to having a solid evidence base. And we're still to this day feeling some of the effects of that decision. And the example that I use here, I live in Cambridgeshire, not a million miles from Northamptonshire. If anyone lives in Northamptonshire, you'll know the complete chaos that was caused in Northamptonshire. Arguably, the Audit Commission would have been there to support the County Council, and in the end, the County Council was abolished, couldn't meet its legal obligations, and has been replaced by two separate institutions. And then the final example I give, now I initially used to propose this as an example, excuse me, of a policy that failed. And I delivered this in a course down in Cheltenham a couple of years ago. And a delegate on the group said, no, it was a massive success. And I've actually changed my view on this. So we may remember the changes to the timetable back in 2018. It was utter chaos. I remember commuting on trains stopping in stations that they weren't supposed to, trains stopping before tunnels because the driver wasn't qualified to drive through a tunnel. No one knew where the trains were going, no one knew where they were stopping. It was complete chaos for a few weeks. Now, arguably, it was a huge change that the government were trying to implement in terms of a national change to the rail timetable. And on the right-hand side, there are an example, and there's a great review into it by the Office of the Rail Regulator onto some of those challenges that they faced. I mean, look at some of the things there. We had the Carillion collapse, we had the issues around strikes with Southern Rail, we had risk management, we had multiple stakeholders, we had an issue around the timetable system as well, the technology, we had lots of infrastructure projects. It was massively ambitious and clearly very high risk. Now, the end result is what government decided to do was to then effectively find the train operating company and said, you fix it. And actually they did. And this goes back to this point about how you deliver change. On some approaches, you do a big bang approach, and others you do more of phased delivery. Now, arguably, could it have worked if we'd done one region at a time and then learnt the lessons and improved it so we minimised the impact to the public? Potentially. Or we could have gone ahead and the big bang approach, which is what they prefer to do, and we ended up where we are. Now, arguably, within a few weeks, we ended up in a situation that the timetable pretty much ended up being successful, and we now run that timetable today. But it's a good example of one that possibly could even be viewed two ways. So finally, bring it all together. Those are the 9 principles that I've just described in their entirety. The 10th principle, which I haven't added, and this is a personal one that I wanted to sort of share with you, and this is really my experience, I guess, working in policy, and something I always advise people who are involved in policy making. And that really is to challenge everything. That's not necessarily to be argumentative, but that's really important about challenging everything. So asking questions about why does the evidence say that? Where does the evidence come from? Who says that? Why is that? Why not, etc. And making sure that you really start building your understanding of the policy area that we're doing as well. So those are the key 10 principles. As I mentioned, and as Alice mentioned at the beginning, we are very keen to roll out those courses on a half day or a day or even a week-long course, and we can crunch through some of those principles in a lot more detail as we work through particular case studies as well. So that has been a real whistle-stop tour. I'm conscious we're bang on 12 o'clock, but Alice, if there's any questions, happy to pick some of those up now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon. I hope everybody found that interesting. So we've had a couple of questions, and I think what we'll do is I'll ask maybe 1 or 2, Simon, just because I'm conscious of time, and then the rest we can answer after and send them out. So we can just answer them, and then people will get their questions answered. So loads of questions coming in, and people are saying thank you very much. And just to so everybody knows, we will share the recording after, and we will also share the slides so everyone can have them. So yeah, Giles and Chris, loads of people are saying thank you, but I'll ask you a couple of questions just before we close, Simon.
Okay.
So Madura asked that how do we get our policy making diverse and as inclusive as possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think for me, that's about engagement. So this is about where policymakers really have to work hard in identifying how you can go out and reach those groups, particularly the ones that are hard to reach. So what are the ways of bringing them on board? And I think that's something that's potentially quite exciting where we are at the moment, because, I think historically policymakers followed a very rigid process. But now we've got opportunities with new people coming into the service and the public sector who I think can bring, think outside the box. So I think it's really important to be inclusive. It's really important to be transparent and actually to be very proactive in going out to those organisations who perhaps represent those hard to reach groups and getting them involved in the policy process. And think very carefully about communication. As we say, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't necessarily going to work for everyone. So think about the language we use, the format, the style, etc. as well. But I think engagement is the key point. Engagement is key. Get out there, speak to those communities and get them to be involved in your policy making.
That's great, Simon. And then we'll just close with this one that says, are there any tips that you can share on how organisations can position themselves so that they would be better identified as key players to policy making?
Yeah, so I'm assuming this is in organisations that are perhaps outside the civil service requirements. Yeah. So see, this is for me, it's a really good question, and I think, you know, I now sort of work in a mixture of public and private sector roles. You know, this is about trying to bridge the gap between those two organisations, or two types of organisations. So I think the private sector needs to take responsibility and actually approaching the civil service and saying to the civil service and the wider public sector, let's have a chat. You know, let's talk about some of the issues that are affecting our industry or our organisation, and engage with those civil servants directly. And I think the civil service needs to respond positively to that, because they're a really useful source of information and advice around what's happening at the ground, and they could be really important allies. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing any of that engagement. You're not breaching any procurement rules. It's simply just about informing the policy development. So I think I put the emphasis on the private sector in particular to go and have those conversations with your public sector colleagues, find out who you need to speak to, and keep those relationships going.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Simon. And thank you everybody for joining us this morning. I really hope that you got a lot out of this webinar. And as Simon mentioned, we can of course look to deliver this as a half day or a full day. And we also deliver it as a 5-day program. Just a quick caveat as well there, we are delivering everything at the moment online, but it is still as engaging as I'm sure you found out in that last hour. Simon, you can now go catch your breath, because that was a lot of talking for you. So thank you very much. And yeah, we will send the recording out in the next couple of days, so do keep an eye on your inbox. But if you have any questions for Simon or I, then do email me. Everybody should have my email address. So thank you very much, and have a lovely afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.